The 1980s gave us neon, synth, and some of the most dangerous science fiction ever committed to film. But some of these movies were so extreme, so transgressive, so wildly ahead of their time that governments, censors, and ratings boards tried to bury them. What if the films they banned were actually the ones most worth watching? Every single one of these 12 sci-fi nightmares is streaming right now, and every single one of them carries scars from the censor's blade. Let's get into it. Altered States, 1980. Ken Russell didn't just make a movie about sensory deprivation tanks and hallucinogenic mushrooms. He detonated a psychedelic grenade inside the MPAA's living room and dared them to pick up the pieces. William Hurt stars as Dr. Edward Jessup, a Harvard scientist who becomes obsessed with unlocking the primal origins of human consciousness. He floats in isolation tanks while consuming ancient tribal compounds. And what he finds isn't enlightenment, it's biological devolution. His body begins physically regressing, transforming into something ancient and terrifying, something that shouldn't exist in a modern laboratory. The hallucination sequences alone are some of the most visually aggressive images to ever earn a mainstream theatrical release. Swirling religious iconography, molten flesh, goat-headed demons, and cosmic explosions of color slam into the viewer without mercy. The MPAA fought Russell hard on several sequences, demanding cuts to the more intense transformation scenes and the visceral ritualistic imagery. Russell pushed back with characteristic fury, insisting every frame was essential to the emotional experience. The film ultimately received an R rating after tense negotiations, but what made it to screen still rattled audiences. Critics were split right down the middle. Roger Ebert gave it 4 stars and called it one of the most genuinely mind-altering films he had ever seen. Others dismissed it as pretentious excess. Paddy Chayefsky, who wrote the screenplay based on his own novel, actually removed his name from the credits after clashing with Russell over the direction. The film earned 2 Academy Award nominations despite all the chaos behind the scenes. William Hurt's performance remains one of the most physically committed debuts in Hollywood history. Altered States is what happens when a fearless director refuses to let a ratings board dictate the boundaries of imagination. Maximum Overdrive, 1986. Stephen King sat in a director's chair exactly once in his career, and the result was a blood-soaked, gasoline-fueled fever dream that censors across the globe tried to chainsaw into submission. King himself has openly admitted he was fueled by substances during the entire production, and honestly, it shows in the most beautifully chaotic way possible. The premise is pure King absurdity. A comet passes Earth, and every machine on the planet becomes homicidal. Trucks, lawnmowers, vending machines, electric carving knives. Emilio Estevez leads a ragtag group of survivors trapped at a North Carolina truck stop, while sentient 18-wheelers circle outside like mechanical sharks. The film's original cut was reportedly far more graphic than what theaters received. The MPAA slapped it with an X rating on the first submission, forcing King and producer Dino De Laurentiis to trim several sequences featuring crushed skulls, steamroller carnage, and a particularly infamous scene involving a kid and a steamroller that was drastically shortened. Multiple international markets cut the film even further, with the UK and Australian releases losing additional minutes of vehicular mayhem. Critics absolutely savaged it. King himself later joked that he had made a wonderful moron movie and that he was coked out of his mind the whole time. But here is the thing. Maximum Overdrive has become a genuine cult classic, beloved by horror fans who appreciate its unhinged energy and its refusal to take itself seriously for even a single frame. The AC/DC soundtrack, composed entirely by the band specifically for this film, is one of the greatest hard rock movie soundtracks ever recorded. Who Made Who still slaps nearly 4 decades later. This film is a monument to unfiltered creative chaos, and the censors only made it more legendary. Liquid Sky, 1982. If you distilled the entire New York underground art scene of the early 1980s into a single film, you would get Liquid Sky, and the establishment had absolutely no idea what to do with it. Directed by Slava Zuckerman, a Soviet émigré working with a shoestring budget, this neon-drenched fever dream follows a tiny alien spacecraft that lands on the rooftop of a Manhattan penthouse inhabited by a new wave fashion model named Margaret. The alien feeds on a chemical produced in the human brain during moments of extreme pleasure, which means anyone who gets intimate with Margaret dies instantly. Their brain essentially liquefies. The film is shot in blazing, oversaturated color, every frame looking like a fashion magazine from another dimension. Traditional critics were horrified. The content was brazenly provocative, the performances deliberately artificial, and the entire aesthetic felt like an assault on conventional filmmaking. Several markets refused to screen it. Theaters that did show it often edited sequences or restricted it to midnight screenings only. The film never received a wide mainstream release in most countries. Zuckerman funded much of the production himself after struggling to find investors willing to back something this aggressively strange. Anne Carlyle delivers a remarkable dual performance, playing both Margaret and her rival Jimmy, embodying the fluid identity politics of the downtown scene years before mainstream culture caught up. The synthesizer score by Zuckerman, Brenda Hutchinson, and Clive Smith became iconic in electronic music circles. Liquid Sky earned over $2 million at the box office against a budget of roughly $500,000, making it one of the most profitable independent films of the decade. It proved that art made outside the system could find an audience, even when every gatekeeper tried to shut the door. Class of 1984, 1982. This film walked into the decade like a switchblade through a metal detector. Director Mark Lester created a dystopian vision of American public schools that was so disturbingly prescient, so unflinchingly violent, that multiple countries flat out banned it. Perry King stars as Andrew Norris, an idealistic music teacher who transfers to Lincoln High School, a crumbling inner-city institution, terrorized by a gang of punk students led by the magnetic and terrifying Timothy Van Patten as Peter Stegman. What begins as classroom intimidation escalates into extortion, assault, and total institutional collapse. The school has metal detectors at the entrance, armed students roaming the halls, and teachers too broken or terrified to intervene. In 1982, this felt like exaggerated dystopian fiction. Today, it reads like a documentary. Finland banned the film outright. Several German territories restricted it to audiences over 18, and the UK delayed its release while the censors debated how much violence to trim. The scenes depicting gang brutality, teacher retaliation, and the film's explosive climax were all flagged as potentially dangerous to young audiences. Roddy McDowall delivers a haunting supporting performance as a biology teacher who has been at the school so long that he now brings a firearm to class. His quiet breakdown is one of the most chilling moments in 80s genre cinema. The film was a commercial hit despite the controversy, grossing well internationally and finding a massive second life on home video. Lester reportedly drew inspiration from real newspaper stories about school violence, and critics who revisited the film in later years admitted it was shockingly ahead of its time. Class of 1984 isn't just exploitation, it's a warning that arrived decades too early. Contamination, 1980. Luigi Cozzi looked at Ridley Scott's Alien and thought, what if I took the chest-bursting scene and built an entire film around it? The result was Contamination, an Italian sci-fi gore spectacle that got itself banned faster than you could say exploding torso. The story begins when a seemingly abandoned cargo ship drifts into New York Harbor, carrying a load of mysterious green eggs from South America. When these eggs are exposed to heat or touched, they detonate, causing anyone nearby to literally burst open in a shower of viscera. A government agent, a colonel, and a disgraced astronaut trace the eggs back to a Colombian coffee plantation, where a Martian Cyclops is orchestrating a full-scale invasion of Earth. Yes, you read that correctly. A Martian Cyclops hiding in a coffee plantation. The UK's Director of Public Prosecutions placed Contamination on the original video, Nasty's List, in 1983, making it illegal to distribute in Britain. The exploding body effects, created on a modest Italian budget using practical gore techniques, were deemed too realistic and too prolonged for public consumption. Distributors who stocked the film faced prosecution and fines. Cozzi has spoken openly about how the ban actually helped the film find a cult audience, as forbidden fruit always tastes sweeter. Goblin, the legendary Italian prog rock band famous for their work with Dario Argento, provided the pulsating electronic score, which elevated the entire production far beyond its budget limitations. Contamination is gloriously trashy, unapologetically gory, and absolutely committed to its own absurd premise. The practical effects hold up remarkably well, each explosion a handcrafted symphony of latex and corn syrup. This is Italian genre filmmaking at its most fearlessly excessive. The Quiet Earth, 1985. New Zealand gave the world one of the most existentially devastating science fiction films of the 1980s, and almost nobody outside of festival circuits saw it uncut for years. Bruno Lawrence stars as Zach Hobson, a scientist who wakes up one morning to discover that every single human being on Earth has vanished. He is completely alone. The event, known as The Effect, appears linked to an energy research project Zach was working on, and the guilt of his potential complicity drives the film's emotional core into genuinely haunting territory. Director Jeff Murphy crafts the empty New Zealand landscape into a character itself. Shopping malls without shoppers, highways without drivers, churches without congregations. Zach's slow psychological unraveling is portrayed with devastating authenticity. Lawrence delivers one of the great unsung performances in sci-fi history, moving from confusion to euphoria to megalomania to crushing despair as the loneliness devours him. He crowns himself king of the world, dresses in women's clothing, sets up cardboard cutout audiences, and eventually fires a shotgun into the sky, screaming at God. International distributors were uncomfortable with the film's bleakness and its refusal to provide comforting answers. Several markets edited the more psychologically intense sequences, particularly Zach's breakdown scenes. The ending, one of the most debated final shots in all of science fiction, was considered so disturbing and ambiguous that some distributors wanted it changed entirely. Murphy refused. That final image, Zach standing on a beach staring at an alien sunrise over a ringed planet, remains one of cinema's great unsolved mysteries. Is he dead? Has he crossed into another dimension? Has the effect transported him to an entirely new reality? The Quiet Earth proves that the scariest apocalypse isn't one filled with monsters. It's one filled with silence. Extro, 1982. The British Board of Film Classification didn't just dislike Extro. The police literally raided video shops to confiscate copies during the height of the video nasty panic. Harry Bromley Davenport's alien abduction nightmare is one of the strangest, most tonally unhinged films to emerge from the early 1980s British genre scene, and the censors treated it like radioactive material. The plot follows Sam Phillips, a father who was abducted by aliens 3 years earlier. He returns to his family, but he is no longer human, not even close. His rebirth scene, in which a full-grown man emerges from a woman's body in a sequence of staggering practical effects, work is one of the most disturbing birth sequences ever filmed. Sam begins transferring alien abilities to his young son Tony, who develops telekinetic powers and the ability to bring toys to life with murderous intent. A life-size toy soldier becomes a killing machine. A Black Panther appears from nowhere. A woman is cocooned in a corner and used as an egg-producing vessel. None of it follows any conventional narrative logic, and that is precisely what makes it so unsettling. The film was seized under Section 3 of the Obscene Publications Act, and Davenport has recounted stories of police officers showing up at distributors with warrants specifically naming Extro, alongside titles like Driller Killer and Cannibal Holocaust. Critics dismissed it as amateurish trash, but the film developed a devoted following on bootleg VHS circuits. The practical creature effects, achieved on a tiny budget, remain impressively grotesque. Extro was eventually cleared of obscenity charges and released uncut years later, but its reputation as one of the nastiest video nasties endures. Davenport went on to make 2 sequels, neither of which captured the unhinged, nightmarish energy of the original. Inseoid, 1981. Norman J. Warren took a crew to the Chislehurst Caves in Kent, England, built some cardboard spaceship corridors, hired Judy Geeson, and somehow created one of the most controversial British sci-fi horror films of the decade. Inseoid follows an archaeological team on a distant planet who discover an ancient alien tomb. After one of the crew is attacked and impregnated by a crystalline alien creature, she transforms into a ravenous, superhuman killing machine driven by a biological imperative to protect her unborn offspring at any cost. Judy Geeson's performance is absolutely feral. She tears through the cast with a savagery that would make Ripley look restrained, biting, slashing, and destroying anyone who threatens her alien pregnancy. The British censors demanded significant cuts to the more graphic violence and the impregnation sequence itself, which combined body horror with deeply uncomfortable thematic territory. International markets were even harsher. Several Asian and Middle Eastern territories banned the film entirely, and the Australian release was cut by several minutes. Warren has spoken in interviews about how the censorship actually damaged the film's pacing, as key character beats were tied to the sequences that got trimmed. The production was notoriously difficult. The caves were freezing cold, the budget was almost non-existent, and the alien creature suit looked like it was assembled from spare parts at a garden center. But Geeson committed fully, delivering a performance of such raw physical intensity that it elevated the entire project. The film was a surprise commercial success in the UK, outperforming several major studio releases during its opening week. Inseoid is rough, raw, and unpolished, but beneath its exploitation surface lies a genuinely primal story about the horror of bodily autonomy being stolen. The censors tried to tame it. They failed. Life Force, 1985. Tobe Hooper followed up Poltergeist by making a $100 million space vampire movie that Cannon Films and American distributors hacked apart like butchers. The original international cut ran 116 minutes. The American theatrical release was brutally chopped to 100 minutes. 16 minutes of character development, narrative context, and atmospheric tension were sacrificed because the studio panicked about the runtime and the content. Based on Colin Wilson's novel, The Space Vampires, the film follows a crew aboard the space shuttle Churchill who discover a massive alien craft hidden in the tail of Halley's Comet. Inside, they find 3 perfectly preserved humanoid bodies in crystal cases. When brought back to Earth, these space vampires awaken and begin draining the life force from every human they encounter, creating an expanding epidemic of energy-starved zombies that eventually engulfs all of London. Matilda May plays the lead vampire, and her performance is genuinely mesmerizing, projecting an otherworldly presence that dominates every frame. American censors were particularly aggressive toward her scenes, cutting heavily and demanding alterations that Hooper publicly resented. Steve Railsback and Peter Firth deliver committed performances anchoring the human side of the story, and Patrick Stewart shows up in a brilliantly bizarre scene involving psychic possession. The practical effects by John Dykstra are extraordinary. The vampire feeding sequences feature desiccated corpses that reanimate and explode, entire buildings crumbling as London descends into apocalyptic chaos. Henry Mancini composed the sweeping orchestral score, giving the film an epic grandeur that the studio clearly didn't understand they had. Life Force was a box office disaster on release, grossing only $11 million against its budget. But time has been extraordinarily kind to it. It is now regarded as one of the most ambitious and visually stunning sci-fi horror films of the decade, and the uncut version reveals a far more coherent and emotionally resonant film than the butchered American release ever suggested. Night of the Comet, 1984. Tom Eberhardt made an apocalypse movie where the last survivors on Earth are 2 Valley Girl sisters with machine guns, and somehow the studio still found reasons to water it down. Catherine Mary Stewart and Kelly Maroney star as Regina and Samantha, 2 teenage sisters living in Los Angeles, who survive a comet's passage that turns most of humanity into either red dust or shambling, flesh-hungry zombies. Regina spent the night in a steel-lined projection booth at the movie theater where she works. Samantha slept in a metal garden shed after a fight with her stepmother. Both were shielded from the comet's radiation by pure coincidence. What follows is one of the most tonally unique genre films of the 1980s, blending genuine post-apocalyptic dread with sharp comedy, sisterly bonding, and a healthy dose of shopping montage set to Cyndi Lauper. The theatrical release was subjected to multiple rounds of edits by the distributor, Atlantic Releasing Corporation. Several zombie attack sequences were trimmed for intensity, and a subplot involving the sinister government scientists at an underground think tank was shortened, weakening the film's third act considerably. Eberhardt has discussed how the original cut had a harder edge, with more graphic zombie encounters and a darker portrayal of the scientists' true intentions. The film earned modest returns theatrically, but became a massive VHS hit, particularly among young female audiences who rarely saw themselves reflected as capable, funny, gun-wielding protagonists in genre cinema. Night of the Comet predates the strong female protagonist trend by decades. Regina is resourceful, fearless, and handles an M16 like a seasoned soldier because her absent military father actually taught her to shoot. The film's influence can be traced through Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Zombieland, and countless other horror comedies that blend suburban mundanity with apocalyptic chaos. The censors tried to soften its edges. The audience sharpened them right back. Tetsuo, the Iron Man, 1989. Japanese filmmaker Shinya Tsukamoto shot this on 16mm black and white film with almost no budget. And the result was so aggressively disturbing that censors across the world recoiled like they had touched a live wire. Tetsuo, the Iron Man is not a comfortable viewing experience. It is an assault. A businessman accidentally hits a metal fetishist with his car. Shortly after, the businessman's body begins transforming. Metal erupts from his flesh. Wires burrow under his skin. His body gradually merges with industrial machinery until he becomes something entirely post-human. A screeching, grinding, sparking fusion of man and metal. Tsukamoto filmed largely in his own apartment and in junk-filled Tokyo alleyways, using stop-motion animation and frantic editing techniques that create a perpetual state of visual anxiety. The film runs only 67 minutes, but it feels like being trapped inside a malfunctioning engine. Japanese censors flagged the film for extreme content, and international markets were even more aggressive. The UK delayed its classification for years. Several European distributors released it only in heavily edited versions, removing the more graphic body transformation sequences and the film's most infamous scene involving a mechanized appendage. Audiences at early festival screenings reportedly walked out in significant numbers, with some viewers physically nauseated by the relentless pace and industrial sound design. Tsukamoto performed, directed, produced, wrote, edited, and did the special effects largely himself. The entire production was a guerrilla filmmaking operation of extraordinary commitment. Critics who championed it compared Tsukamoto to David Lynch and early David Cronenberg, citing Tetsuo as a radical evolution of body horror. The film launched the Japanese cyberpunk movement and directly influenced films, music videos, video games, and visual art for the next 3 decades. Industrial bands like Nine Inch Nails cited it as a major visual touchstone. Tetsuo. The Iron Man proves that the most dangerous cinema doesn't need money. It needs obsession. The 1980s were a golden age of science fiction that pushed too hard, went too far, and paid the price for refusing to play it safe. Every single one of these 12 films carries the marks of censorship, and every single one of them is better because someone tried to stop people from seeing them. Which of these banned or censored sci-fi films hit you the hardest? Which one do you think never deserved the controversy? Drop your pick in the comments. And here is the real question. If censors fought this hard against rubber monsters and practical gore in the 1980s, what would they do with the stuff filmmakers are creating today? Or have we just stopped caring about what art is allowed to show us?